As we continue looking at how Moses proclaimed the Christ, we're going to see in the child of promise, in Isaac, that there was a prophecy not only of the virgin birth, but a prophecy relating to the fact that the Christ was going to suffer and die and be raised from the dead. This particular passage is again allegorical, and as I mentioned in our video on Jesus, the Ark of Salvation, it's not our intention simply to make every passage into an allegory. But once again, we make this claim based on what the New Testament itself says. In Hebrews chapter 11, we read this: "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, 'In Isaac your descendants shall be called.' He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type." This particular passage in the book of Hebrews tells us that by faith Abraham believed God, and when he received back Isaac, he received him back as a type of the Christ that was to come. This word type is a technical term, and it means that this was a figure or an illustration. And so when we say that this is an allegorical or a typified presentation of who Christ is, we're doing so based on the foundation of the teaching of the New Testament. In our previous video talking about the promised seed, we looked at the promise that God had made to Abram in Genesis 12, in Genesis 15, and in Genesis 22. And we see that Isaac becomes the immediate fulfillment that is going to lead to Christ being the ultimate fulfillment. In Genesis chapter 17, God speaks to Abram, and he says in verse 21, "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." This was in regard to Abraham asking God to bless Ishmael, his son. Ishmael was the product of Abraham's impatience, thinking to achieve God's purposes and promise, not according to faith, but according to their own fleshly means. When God made this promise that in Abraham all the families of the earth would be blessed, and in particular to this seed, God knew exactly what he was doing. God chose a man and a family who had been barren for their entire life. Abraham and Sarah were not able to have children. As they got older and older, the prospect of ever having children became more and more impossible. In fact, when God promised that they would have a child, Abraham and Sarah, a biological child of their own, this caused Abraham and Sarah both to laugh. That's why they tried in their own flesh to have a descendant another way. And Sarah gave Abraham one of her maids, and that's where Ishmael came from. But this was not God's plan. This was a fleshly attempt to do things in their own strength and power. And God's timing, he continued to wait and to wait and to wait until Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old, to demonstrate the power of God to be able to fulfill everything that he said. In a sense, this was prophesying the virgin birth, that everything we could ever think of, every person who's ever been born always has to be born of a biological union between a male and a female. God chose to bring forth the promised child Isaac to Abraham and Sarah from a dead womb, well past childbearing years, to demonstrate that God is able to do things that humans cannot. Likewise, the true seed, that is Christ, comes forth from a womb that should have been barren, not because Mary was beyond childbearing years, but because she had never yet known a man. This particular child, when he was born, Isaac, grew up before his father. And then God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable, to offer up his son. We read this in Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 22, we read about how God tested Abraham. Now, this word testing was also used in Hebrews, that God was testing Abraham. We can understand this in two different ways. Some, they might take this to say that God was testing Abraham to see what he would do, to find out what it was that Abraham would do. This is an incorrect way to take this. Another way to take testing isn't to try and figure something out, but to purify or refine something that you already have. In fact, this is what a goldsmith does, for example, when they test their metal. They already know what they have, but they purify it by exposing it to heat and burning away all the impurities. In this sense, testing isn't to try and find something out, but is to refine what you already know that you have. There's a big difference between these two things. And God knew what he had in Abram. He had a man who trusted him, and so he tested Abraham by refining his faith to refine what he already knew that he had, a faithful believer. As we read this account in Genesis chapter 22, we read in verse 8 that Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb and for the burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. A few verses later, in verses 13 and 14, it says, "Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called on the name of that place, 'The Lord will provide,' as it is said to this day, 'In the mount of the Lord it will be provided.'" As Abraham, by faith, offered up his son, the author of Hebrews says that he did this as a type. God chose this particular test to refine Abraham's faith, but also to put here a type, a foreshadowing of what God himself would do. Sometimes people look at this passage and think that God must be a monster to ask Abraham to sacrifice his son. And make no mistake, this is a tense passage. But God intended all along to allow Abraham's son to live, foreshadowing, however, that the Christ would come to suffer and to die. In this particular passage, as we read it in Genesis, Abraham believed all along that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead, as he had already received Isaac miraculously from Sarah's dead womb and in his own old age. And yet, as Abraham's faith is being put to the test, we see a type that the Christ, the promised descendant, not the immediate fulfillment in Isaac, but the Messiah who is to come, that he is going to suffer and likewise be raised from the dead. While some may point to God and say, look at this tense passage, God must be a monster to do this, we must understand that Abraham's son was never in any danger, but God's own son, Jesus, the Lamb of God, who comes in fulfillment of this passage, was coming to suffer and to die. While some might get upset about the imagery itself, most of the time it's because they simply do not understand the seriousness of sin and the fact that without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness. While Isaac wasn't in any danger, he served as a type to show that the Messiah was coming to suffer, that he would not be spared from his own executors, as he suffered after being handed over by his own people, the Jews, condemned as a blasphemer, as he was crucified under the Roman government as an enemy of the state, and as he suffered under the wrath of God on that terrible cross, not for his own sins, but for the sins of the world. When Jesus Christ rose from the dead, it was typified by Isaac that he too came down with his father from the mountain that day after going up. As Isaac returned from that day of sacrifice, and as the author of Hebrews says, that he received him back from the dead as a type, telling us that the Christ not only was going to suffer, but that he was to rise from the dead. Many people use this passage of the Lord will provide in a prosperity context, speaking of material things. But this was fulfilled in the book of John, when John the Baptist looked up and saw Jesus walking toward him and said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." God was not being cruel in testing and refining Abraham's faith. And although the situation was tense, it was simply a foreshadowing of a much more tense situation when the Lamb of God came into the world to willingly lay down his own life to save a people for himself from every tribe, tongue, and nation. By faith, Abraham was willing to do whatever God said because he knew that God was even able to raise Isaac from the dead. And as Abraham trusted in God that day, we likewise should trust in God who sent forth his Son, not just to suffer, but also to rise again from the dead, to demonstrate with power that he is exactly who he claimed to be, and that he is able to save all who come to him in humble faith. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the thumbs up button and consider subscribing so that you won't miss any of our future videos.